This is the World Organic News for the week ending 9th of July 2018. John Moore reporting. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. A quick piece of housekeeping. My request for whoever had contacted me No Dig Gardening resulted in Curtis getting back in touch. So thank you, Curtis, for your kind sentiments on the Facebook page World Organic News. As a result of Curtis getting in touch with me to start with, I set up a creatively entitled page on the blog, Free Downloadable PDF Farming Books. Have a look. I received nothing for these. They are free downloads from the links given. Now we begin this week with what won't be news to our Northern Hemisphere listeners in a post from World News Forum entitled Red Hot Planet. Quote, from the normally mild summer climes of Ireland, Scotland and Canada to the scorching Middle East, numerous locations in the Northern Hemisphere have witnessed their hottest weather ever recorded over the past week. Large areas of heat pressure or heat domes scattered around the hemisphere led to the sweltering temperatures. No single record in isolation can be attributed to global warming, but collectively these heat records are consistent with the kind of extremes we expect to see increase in a warming world. End quote. Just a quick note, here in Ireland the record temperature was set back on the 26th of June 1887 when the mercury hit a very balmy 33.3. The point of the quote, though, remains valid. It has been hot, and hot across great swathes of the Northern Hemisphere, and the heat is having an effect. People are dying in Canada, irrigation turned on in Ireland. It is a strange, strange time. One part of the population directly affected by changes in climate is the agricultural horticultural sectors. I've discussed in other episodes the farmer in Australia who cut silage 10 weeks earlier than his father did, and the moves by wine growers in Australia to head further from the equator by planting in the southern island state of Tasmania. Now we have a post from a Floresta Nova entitled Impact of Global Warming on Food Worldwide. The post has a video showing the drought and flood effects of climate change, and their solution sounds quite familiar. Quote, reforestation with food forests seems to be the best answer for creating food resilience. More productivity per square metre when using permaculture and rebalancing the ratio between crops, less of them, and vegetables, more of them. Carbon sequestration to reduce global warming, and weather stability, temperature, hygromany, and extreme weather. The issue stands in the agro-industry where crop is considered as biomass, an input in the transformation process to produce industrial food. Re-architecturing the supply chain would represent a monumental investment and an important shift in the balance of power. End quote. As I've pointed out before, and we already know how to fix this, the end of the last sentence sums up our problems, a monumental investment and an important shift in the balance of power. I'm torn between tearing down the system to rebuild it, working within for a change and ignoring the whole thing and getting on with what's needed. The shift in the balance of power is unlikely to occur willingly. Indeed, I find it difficult to think of a time when power was rebalanced without some sort of conflict, and this saddens me. There's more than enough violence in the world without more being needed to effect change. Clearly, though, outside events seem to be impinging upon the human world, and these may be just what's needed. As I mentioned above and previously, winemakers are at the coalface of climate change. And yes, I said that deliberately. My puns can be that bad. Let's just take a moment to think about wine production. Long-lived, relatively slow to produce or return perennial plants dependent upon fairly narrowly defined amounts of sunlight, heat, water, and a given number of days chilling in winter to achieve a wine that may vary year to year, but people expect to know what they're getting is related to what's on the label. So it comes as no surprise to find a post from the Ideal Wine Company entitled How the Global Wine Industry is Adapting Fast to Climate Change. Quote, from the vineyards in South Africa affected by prolonged drought to vineyards in California and Australia, wine growers are seeing clear effects of climate change as the temperatures continue to rise year on year. End quote. This is a problem for fruit setting, fruit growth, ripening temperatures and wine flavours. And further from the piece, another quote from Spain. Quote, important Spanish producer, Familia Torres, owns wineries in Chile and California, and has also brought land 1,200 metres high in the Pyrenees as a decisive investment in cooler areas. The average temperatures across their vineyards have risen by 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 4 decades, and harvests are now 10 days earlier than they were 20 years ago. And further north in Europe, vineyards are also cornering the market in Brittany, in the northwest corner of France. Previously, this was untenable for winemakers due to too much rain, not enough sunshine and Atlantic winds. Today, vineyards are being planted as far north as Sweden, end quote. As I said, wine growers are at the coalface. But I hear people cry. Haven't we as a species lived through changes before? Well, I'm so glad you asked. From the blog Novo Scriptorium comes the post, "Could the Neolithic Revolution offer evidence of the best ways to adapt to climate change?" Now, before we dive into this post, it is worth remembering that at the start of the Holocene some 10,000 years ago, there were a lot less humans on the planet than there are now. Certainly no cities existed, none like the megacities of today, which are mostly located on coasts, or close enough to them to be affected by rising sea levels. But let's have a look at the post. Quote, "Human behaviour during the last intense period of global warming might offer an insight into how best to adapt to current climate change, a study suggests. Research led by the University of Plymouth shows that between 10 and 15,000 years ago, a major shift in climate conditions led to the planet becoming significantly warmer and wetter. This sounds familiar, if not a direct copy of what's happening now." Continuing the quote. This led to a range of responses from and consequences for people living at the time, both including staggered population increases and effects on crops. Scientists have examined archaeological environmental data from the period and believe we could potentially learn from past human experiences, end quote. So what happened in the period from 15,000 to 10,000 years ago was that the climate changed in what appears to be two stages. One, things got warmer and wetter, and they dried and cooled, and then they warmed and moistened again. The point here is that change was not linear. While we appear to be moving into a warming trend, the last northern winter was brutal. Adaptations will be needed if a similar pattern emerges to be capable of moving in both directions, probably at different places on Earth at the same time. This is what we do as a species, we problem solve. So we are capable of both adapting to the changes and dealing with the root causes. Indeed, we can fix this. The birth of the Holocene was not a result of human actions, yet it had some similarities to today's conditions. The evidence from the post was collected in Southwest Asia, the fertile crescent of school textbooks, and I find the outcomes quite interesting. Quote, "By examining records of past climate and vegetation from caves, lakes and archaeological sites, they discovered that the climate of the region changed from being cold and dry to being significantly warmer and wetter. As the climate warmed, the population increased, but this trend began earlier in some areas than others, even though the climatic warming occurred at the same time everywhere. In areas where socio-ecological continuity was maintained through periods of adverse climate, human communities were able to respond rapidly to subsequent climatic improvement. By contrast, in areas where there was a break in settlement at these times, population was slower to react to the new opportunities provided by the interglacial world." End quote. From this I would read that cooperation and interdependence have greater benefits than cutting and running, or perhaps being wiped out. Certainly the latter option is not optimal. Those areas which were depopulated were as related to nomadic grazing as they were to destruction of populations. It is not surprising then that the herders were less able to take up cereal production than those who had stuck with it through the climatic changes. This tells us we need to keep adapting our food production methods to the changing climate. The wine growers cited earlier are one such example. Plant breeders are already well into the process of selecting wheat, rice and maize better suited to drier, hotter conditions. If we combine these new cultivars with perennial plant structures as part of agriculture, we should be able to adapt to changes in either direction, given sufficient time. Indeed, by increasing the perennial portion of our agricultural systems and implementing regenerative agriculture in general, we can mitigate and reverse the excess CO2 we have as a species added to the atmosphere and oceans. Never forget we are Homo sapiens, the thinking ape. I would like to see considerably more thinking and much less posturing. I live in hope. Now to our last post. Nendo Dango, from the blog Trail and Traces. Nendo Dango? Quote, "An earth ball or clay seed ball, or Nendo Dango in Japanese, is a seed that has been wrapped in soil materials, usually a mixture of clay and compost, and then dried." End quote. I do apologise if I've mangled the Japanese there. Now, those of you who have made use of the newest page on worldorganicnews.com, the, as I stated, creatively named free downloadable PDF farming books page, will be aware this is a technique beloved to Masanobu Fukuoka. By the 1980s, Fukuoka was a world figure in the regenerative agricultural field. And I quote, "In 1985, Fukuoka spent 40 days in Somalia and Ethiopia sowing seeds to revegetate desert areas, including working in remote villages and a refugee camp. Seed ball creation, or Nendo Dango, has been widely used throughout Africa. The contents of some seed bombs are now placed in a biodegradable container and bombed grenade style to the land. As the sprout grows, the container biodegrades into the soil. The process is usually done on a large-scale project with hundreds dropped in a single area. With enough water, adequate sunlight and low competition from existing flora and fauna, seed-bombed land could be host to new plants in as little as a month." End quote. There is always a way, and if Fukuoka, Holmgreen and Mollison teach us anything, it is that simple things working with nature are infinitely more powerful tools for beneficial change than not working with nature. As I said, there's a downloadable link to the copy of Fukuoka's One Straw Revolution available on that page. And with that, I'll draw this episode to a conclusion. Remember, decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. As a podcast listener, you may be thinking of producing your own podcast, but you're not sure where to begin. Drop over to mrjohnmoore.com, pick up the free checklists I've written to help you get started. I'm also doing live presentations twice a week and putting them up as podcasts under the show name Pod Thoughts to help you through the process. Link in the show notes, details at the website mrjohnmoore.com. A transcript of this episode is available at worldorganicnews.com. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week.